My talk is titled What the Butler Saw. No, what Guy Butler saw. And I can't really do a Craddock accent, but here goes. We expect him to pass in the second class, quote unquote. Second class. How could Professor Butler know that? I mean, I hadn't even finished writing exams. And when the results confirmed that I'd achieved a lower second, I was convinced that the game had been rigged. For years, that single sentence was all I remembered from my valedictory testimonial. Guy Butler was professor of both English and speech and drama, and as those were my two majors, I was destined to have a lot to do with him during my time at Rhodes University. He made a late and untheatrical entrance and stood there catching his breath as he faced us first-year drama students. I had absolutely no idea what a professor of drama should look like, but I'm sure I imagined something more flamboyant than the seemingly staid figure in a jacket and tie. He looked ancient, at least 50. And unmistakably of my father's generation, which meant he couldn't possibly be interesting. I found it hard to imagine that he had ever been young. Convention dictated that staff addressed students as either Miss or Mr. And I felt rather flattered when lecturers addressed me as Mr. Ackerman. But Prof. Butler always called me Ackerman, even when I was a postgraduate. It irked me because I felt he regarded me as something like an overgrown schoolboy. I was dimly aware that he had written and published poetry. Posters of his plays, Take Root or Die, and Cape Charade, adorned the foyer of the Rhodes Little Theatre. I was told they were about the 1820 settlers. From the photos I'd seen of those settlers, they seemed distinctly unglamorous dramatic material. Men with gnarled faces and mutton chop whiskers standing next to hatchet-faced harridans wearing bonnets. I was far more interested in the iconoclastic international playwrights. The witty anti-establishment tirades of John Osborne's Jimmy Porter. Harold Pinter's EastEnders mumbling non sequiturs to each other as they search for the weasel under the cocktail cabinet. And Samuel Beckett's forlorn tramps in the play Where Nothing Happens, twice. Although I knew I was born to play Hamlet, neither the play nor the part was on offer. In my second year, at the height of my antipathy towards organised religion, I was cast as the Reverend Young, a Wesleyan minister in a new Guy Butler play entitled Richard Gush of Salem. In my third year, Prof directed A Midsummer Night's Dream. This came less than a year after Peter Brook's landmark staging of the play in Stratford-upon-Avon. People who'd seen the Brook production spoke about it as reverentially as people who had seen the Virgin in Fatima in 1917. But Prof was not impressed. Once again, Hamlet had eluded me and I had to play Lysander. By now I'd been to London and I'd seen about 20 productions, including Hamlet, starring Alan Bates, and shows with full frontal nudity, including Hair and O Calcutta. Although we knew that nudity was a non-starter, we did ask Prof if, like in some London productions, we could make entrances through the auditorium instead of always through the wings. He simply smiled, that special smile reserved for people who make stupid suggestions, told us to run a scene again, pushed his glasses back onto his top of his head, rubbed the heels of his hands into his eyes, and leaned back in the stalls listening to the beat of the iambic pentameters. Prof was not only one of South Africa's preeminent Shakespearean scholars, he was also a champion of local writing in English. At his suggestion, the self-exiled writer William Plumer was invited to inaugurate the Wits Conference on the future of South African writing in July 1956. And thereafter, Prof continued to wage a long and sometimes lonely struggle to have books by local writers prescribed at schools and universities. At the time, I didn't see the point. I was convinced that all South African writing, well, apart from Ethel Fugard and Herman Charles Bosman, of course, was mediocre. Although I hadn't read it, I couldn't imagine that the story of an African farm was in the same league as Wuthering Heights. I was convinced that Prof was a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. His Christian beliefs provided the lens through which he viewed the world and interpreted art. Brooks' interpretation of A Midsummer Night's Dream came out of his interaction with the Polish critic Jan Kot, whose Shakespeare, Our Contemporary, had been published by Methuen in 1965. In the preface he wrote for the English translation, Brooke drew parallels between the autocratic Elizabethan England and the authoritarian police state of Soviet-controlled Poland. In a third-year essay, I cavalierly swept aside any possibility of Christian redemption in King Lear, embraced Kott's apocalyptic worldview, and supported my argument with a quotation from a chapter entitled King Lear and Endgame. Kott's audacity in drawing parallels between Shakespeare and Beckett elicited an acerbic comment in red ballpoint, typical Kott rot. During the Michaelmas vacation in my third year, I received a letter from the English department. I opened it and read with growing amazement that Prof had invited me to do honours the following year. I was flattered, although possibly more amazed than flattered. I'd already set my sights on the director's course at the Old Vic Theatre School in Bristol, but had been told that BA stood for bugger all, and if you needed to get onto a postgraduate course in the UK, you needed at least to have an honours degree. The relatively new drama department didn't offer honours, and as I didn't want to change universities, I accepted what was on offer. A perk of being a postgraduate was attending colloquia at High Corner, which was Guy Butler's house. I vividly recall two of Prof's guests that year. One was Richard Reeve, who was doing doctoral research on Olive Schreiner in Oxford. His radio play, Make Like Slaves, had just won a BBC competition, and we sat and listened while we stared at the reel-to-reel tape recorder. The other guest was Ace Krieger. He had just completed a new Afrikaans translation of King Lear and told us how he'd gone about it. He said he first tackled the great speech that begins, "Howl, howl, howl, oh you are men of stones." Once he had got that right, he said, it gave him the confidence he needed to complete the task. So, are your sights set on RADA? They don't offer a director's course. I see. I hope to get accepted by the Bristol Old Vic. Oh yes, very good. I visited the school in 1960, but there are only 4 places on the course. And if you don't get in, I'll try some others. Well, here's the testimonial you asked for. Thanks, Prof. Best of luck, Ackerman. While studying in the UK, my curiosity got the better of my disdainful attitude towards South African literature, and I read The Story of an African Farm. That was a big mistake. It touched a raw nerve, precipitated chronic homesickness, and made me a stranger to Europe. Had he known, I'm sure it would have brought a knowing smile to Prof's lips. In 1975, I relocated to Amsterdam. Although I came to admire several Dutch writers, I became increasingly focused on South African literature. J.M. Coetzee had recently made his sensational debut with Dusklands, and before long, both he and Nadine Gordimer were awarded the prestigious Booker Prize. Vernie February, academic and poet, was exiled in the Netherlands, and usually over a couple of beers, he'd give me some pointers. Have you read Turbot Wolf? No. Who's that by? In 1983, I'd written and staged Somewhere on the Border. Initially with only one play to my name, I wasn't sure if that entitled me to call myself a writer. When I got over that, I certainly didn't consider myself a Dutch writer, even if I'd written the play in Amsterdam. In the woke parlance of today, I identified as a South African writer. In the early 1980s, I read Peter Alexander's Roy Campbell, A Critical Biography. I'd encountered some of Campbell's poetry at prep school, and in England I'd read Light on a Dark Horse, his often improbable autobiography, which he called an autobuggeroffery, in which he reinforced his He-Man image with stories of dangling his wife out of the window of their apartment in Soho to teach her who wore the trousers in their marriage. So it came as quite a surprise to read that Mary had had an affair that almost destroyed this marriage, and that her lesbian lover was Vita Sackville-West. That planted the seed of an idea for a play that I would write several years later. Peter Alexander told another story that intrigued me. In January 1955, Campbell, then resident in Portugal, was in London to see doctors. Prof, who just also happened to be in London, wanted to meet the great poet and thank him in person for the favourable review he'd written for his debut volume of poetry called Stranger to Europe. Campbell suggested a pre-prandial drink at his local pub, and inevitably they never got around to lunch. The way Prof described this meeting to Peter Alexander gave me my first glimpse of him as a younger man. In Prof's telling of the story, Campbell called him Butler. By then I'd read many stories by and about Campbell, and in none of them had I ever come across him using somebody's surname as a familiar form of address. In Athol Fugard's dedication to Olive Schreiner and After, which were essays written in honour of Guy Butler, he recalls sending a poem to Prof in 1957 and receiving this comment: "Fugard, this needs more work." That's when it occurred to me that it was a British public school thing Prof must have picked up in Oxford, and that it was a form of friendly rather than condescending address. In 1990, I returned to South Africa after an absence of 17 years and was invited to be an adjudicator at the Student Drama Festival at the National Arts Festival. One evening, I attended a dinner at the 1820 Settlers Monument and found myself sitting opposite the man himself. I was sitting next to his wife, and as I knew that they'd adopted 2 children, I told Jean how I'd just met my birth mother for the first time. Then I noticed Prof smiling at me. "So you're based overseas, Ackerman?" "In Amsterdam." "Like it?" "Well, it's not home." "Yes, I'm sure." "I read about the liquid lunch you had with Roy Campbell and the Catherine Wheel." "Where was that?" Peter Alexander's biography. Oh yes, of course. Actually, I've written a longer account of that meeting. Where's that? In the last volume of my autobiography. Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't read that. It's only coming out next year. What's the title? A Local Habitation. I'll look out for it. I've been collecting material on Roy Campbell for a couple of years. Why is that? I want to write a play about Campbell. Yes. Well, while you're here, you'd better visit Nelm. We have quite a few Campbell manuscripts. On one level, Dark Outsider, the title I'd chosen for my play about Campbell, was a debate I was having with myself about my own exile, and I wanted to be at home when I wrote it. In May 1991, I returned for an extended period. I spent the first 6 weeks reading and rereading everything by and about Campbell, making copious notes and plotting the outline for the play. When I reread Peter Alexander's account of Prof's meeting in London, I remembered our conversation in Grahamstown the previous year, walked up to the Rosebank Library and took out their copy of A Local Habitation. The book contains much of interest besides his bibulous encounter with Campbell in the Catherine Wheel, which he poignantly characterised as two South African exiles weeping into their beers next to the waters of Babylon. I was also reminded that Prof had been born and bred in Craddock. That provided an unexpected connection, as I'd only recently discovered that this is where some of my biological antecedents had lived. My great-grandfather is buried here, and my maternal grandfather, Edward Farnham, was born here in 1867, the year the 12-year-old Olive Schreiner came to live here and received her first years of formal education. Most of my Irish ancestors had left before the Butlers called Craddock home, and Prof was 3 years old when Olive Schreiner died and was reinterred on Biffelskorp. When he was 8 or 9, Mary Butler, his journalist aunt, who had attended the reinterment on the 13th of August 1921, took him up to Biffelskorp. Standing at her ironstone sarcophagus made a profound impression on the young Guy. I imagine this moment as the epiphany from which he emerged destined to be a champion of South African literature. I completed Dark Outsider in 1991, and it took about another 4 years to find its way onto a stage. I directed it for Pact, and the production was presented at the main festival in Grahamstown. On Saturday night, Guy and Jean Butler walked up to me after the performance. They were smiling. "Marvellous, Ackerman." "Thank you, Guy." "Bloody marvellous." "It was lovely, Anthony." "Thank you, Jean." "Come around for coffee tomorrow morning." "Coffee? You remember where we live, don't you?" As Guy and Jean wandered off, I felt I'd just been upgraded from a second class to a first. The play had opened to good reviews, and I'd received compliments from many quarters, but somehow it was special coming from him. I felt like a son who'd finally won the approval of his father. On Sunday morning, I arrived at High Corner at the appointed time. Come in. "Milk and sugar, Anthony. I think he might like a whiskey." "A whiskey? Or is it too early from you?" No, I'll have a whiskey." "Bloody marvellous. If you don't mind, I'm sticking with coffee, Guy." That's Jean. "And Ackerman and I will have a whiskey. Just a single." You captured the characters perfectly, and I was bowled over by the casting. The performances were bloody marvellous. It was exactly how I knew them. "Did you ever meet Vita Sackville-West?" "No, she's the only one I never met, but Van der Post, Plumer, Ace, he's the only one I ever met." "Ace?" "Yes." "Where was that?" "Here, in this room, during one of the colloquia you organised when I was doing honours." "What year was that, Ackerman?" 1972. Let me just write that down. I'm 77 now, and if I don't write things down, I don't remember. "When you met Campbell at the Catherine Wheel," yes, we got pretty woozy. "Another whiskey?" "Thank you. You said Campbell gave you his recipe for bobotie." How do you know that? It's in a local habitation. Oh, yes. He said, Butler, I'm going to give you something imperishable that you can enjoy for the rest of your life. I took out my notebook and pencil, thinking he was going to give me a great universal truth. What is it, Mr. Campbell? He put down his beer glass and said, my recipe for bobotie. And you lost that notebook. How do you know? It's in your book. Oh, of course. But 4 years later, I was touring the United States and we had dinner with Professor Heilman in Seattle. And his wife served this delicious bobotie. She said she'd been given the recipe by a touring South African poet called Roy Campbell. Here you are. I think I poured you a double. Looks more like a treble. Anyway, Jean got the recipe from Mrs. Heilman. I most certainly did. I'm glad you put it in your book because I've used it ever since. Really? You know, when Rhodes awarded Van der Post an honorary doctorate, Jean served that bobotie for lunch. And he said it was the best bobotie he had ever tasted. She offered him the recipe, but he said he didn't cook. Well, I do. You know, Ackerman, I admire people who try to live from their writing. It's precarious, Guy. Yes, but I suppose I'd have used what talent I have more if I hadn't been in the university. I still have that testimonial Guy handed me in November 1972. Although I must have read it all the way through at the time, after reading that I was expected to pass in the second class, my bruised ego obviously blotted out the rest. What he went on to write was generous and almost embarrassingly complimentary. And for all those years, I was the one at fault for misjudging him. Thank you.